Trevor Bechtel, the Dean here at Grebel, and I'm very happy to welcome you to this penultimate Mennonite Writers event this evening. We've enjoyed a rich panoply of treats, literary treats, over the last academic year, and this continues tonight. We have our trademark set up for this series with some lovely red chairs in the background, and you can look at those. This is kind of the red chair Mennonite Writers series. I think when the historians document it, they'll talk about it that way. Thank you for noticing. We won't be having a discussion. Rob Zacharias is unable to be with us tonight. Rob has put this series together. He is the Banting postdoctoral fellow with the Department of English Languages and Literature on the campus of the University of Waterloo. And I also want to take the opportunity to acknowledge that department for supporting the writing series. Instead, after the reading, we'll move directly to a more kind of informal question and answer with the audience. I also want to acknowledge the support of the Canada Council, and Grebel has also supported this event, particularly through our Institute of Anabaptist and Mennonite Studies. Conrad Grebel has been hosting writing at its various rooms and events for over 30 years, and the person who has spearheaded this is Hildy Friesen. So it is fitting that we're able to give her an opportunity to introduce one of the writers in this series as well. Hildy was at Grebel for 25 years, teaching a variety of subjects, and focusing on English, teaching peace and conflict studies. And so Hildy, I'm glad to welcome you, and enjoy the evening.
Thank you, Trevor. I'll simply briefly go through the format for the evening, which won't be unusual for most of you. This is, as Trevor mentioned, the next to last reading in the series, and so I'll comment very briefly on what's coming next. Then I'd like to introduce David Bergen. He'll read, and we'll have a Q&A, and there are books for sale in the foyer, and David would be delighted, I'm sure, to sign them. And they're at a very good price too, I think. In 2 weeks, on March the 4th, here at 7:30, in the last session of this series, Carrie Snyder, who's a Grebel alum, will read from her new novel, A Girl Runner. Some of you will know that Carrie is an active blogger, and last week she wrote of a knock on the door. She went to the door, and there stood a florist delivering a congratulatory bouquet from her publisher in the United Kingdom. Carrie's novel, which created a palpable stir at the Frankfurt Book Fair last year, appeared in the UK and in Australia this month. Carrie takes great pleasure in the variety of covers and titles the novel, Girl Runner, is being given in its many iterations around the world. In the USA, Germany, France, Spain, Italy, Sweden, Netherlands, Poland, Catalonia, Turkey, Hungary, and Latin America. It's being translated into 8 languages in 11 territories. So come hear Carrie read from her Canadian edition. I guarantee she'll read in English on March the 4th here. But tonight we have a wonderful Canadian literary star, David Bergen, here with us. I first encountered David Bergen in 1989, and actually I thought we might talk about this, but we haven't had a chance to talk about it because I don't remember all the details. But I had become aware of a few of his very early stories and managed to locate him to ask whether he'd be willing to have me publish a couple of stories in some special issues of Mennonite's writing that I'd been commissioned to edit for the New Quarterly and Prairie Fire. David was in Vietnam at the time that I wrote to him, working with MCC. He wrote back promptly saying yes, And I was delighted, and in 1990, New Quarterly and Prairie Fire published 2 stories that would later appear in his first collection, Sitting Opposite My Brother, 1993. David has come to Waterloo on a few occasions, one in 1994, when I interviewed him, and at that time he declared, I just reread that today, that he was not interested in writing a coming-of-age novel. And now he's done that. And maybe a few versions of that. David landed on the Canadian literary scene with a bang. His first 4 published stories, at least, each one were selected for the Journey Prize anthology, which every year selects the best stories produced in Canada. He would appear on national and international award lists as contender and winner over and over and over again. And the list of prizes and nominations are way too long to provide here, but they include the Giller Prize, the Governor General's Award, New York Times Notable Book Award, the Writers' Trust Award in recognition of a remarkable body of work, and the Dublin Literary Award that promotes excellence in world literature. He's published that collection of short stories I mentioned, Sitting Opposite My Brother, 1993, and since 1996, 8 novels, many of which, maybe all of which, are available in the foyer. A Year of Lesser, 1996, See the Child, 1999, The Case of Lena S., 2002, The Time in Between, which was a Giller winner, 2009, The Retreat, 2005, The Retreat, 2008, The Matter with Morris, 2010, The Age of Hope, and many of you will have heard him read from that 2 years ago, right here in a series just before this one, 2012, and Leaving Tomorrow, novel number 8 in 2014. Today he'll read from Leaving Tomorrow, a book that, like his other work, has drawn great admiration and praise. Pure pleasure, exults one reviewer. A novel to treasure, exclaims another. Welcome back to Grebel, David. We are pleased to hear you read. Please join me in welcoming.
It's very nice to be back here. Is this okay? Are we getting the sound here?
It's a little bit higher.
A little bit higher.
Awesome.
How's that? Okay. So, the coming-of-age novel that I wasn't going to write, although I think every novel in some ways is a coming-of-age novel. In particular, perhaps, maybe I'm trying to figure out why I said that. And maybe it's because every novelist who writes a first novel, and I hadn't yet written a novel at that point, fears that it will be a coming-of-age novel, because what else can you write except about yourself? And you write in the first person. And I didn't write a book in the first person or a novel in the first person until I wrote this book, which was my 8th novel. And it wasn't that I set out and said to myself, okay, I'm going to write it, now it's time to write a book in the first person. It was more that it just fell into the voice just sort of fell into that mode, and I went along with it. And one of the difficulties of writing in the first person, I don't find it difficult in a short story, but over an extended period, it's difficult to sustain the voice. And I've read many first-person voices novels that fail at some point because the voice is not sustained. And I won't say what they are or who they are, but it's just, I think a first-person voice can be very tough. It's very intimate. It's very confessional. It, of course, borders on the possibility of the narrator who can't be believed. In fact, when I read a review of this novel, and they talked about being able to trust the voice in here and the character Arthur who tells the story, I thought, well, of course you could trust Arthur. You know, I trust Arthur. Why wouldn't you trust Arthur? So it kind of surprised me that there would be a nod in that direction, because I didn't want to necessarily play that game of the unreliable narrator. But maybe it's inevitable that if you have a first-person voice, that's what happens. So when I began the story, And beginning a novel for me is always, I'm beginning a new novel now, and it's always, it's like going fishing in a way, because you really don't know what you're going to catch. And that can be both a lot of fun, or it can be frustrating. And I would prefer to think that it's fun. And you have to almost, I have to almost relax into the mode of just saying, well, whatever comes will come. And then seeing if it works. And then I discovered, I'd written 100 pages, and I realized I was going to be throwing out the first 60 pages of the novel because the beginning started on page 60. And I only realized that last week. So this is the novel that I'm working on now. But that's okay. Those 60 pages that came before are tremendous background, and they sort of laid a foundation for where I was headed. And so starting a novel is always, like I say, it's a bit of a fishing expedition, and that's how this novel began. The main character in here is Arthur Volgemuth. Of course, Arthur is an artist, or wants to be an artist, but he grows up on a ranch, a small ranch in Alberta, where artists are not known to come from, and he wants to defy that notion, and he wants to be not only an artist, he wants to be a novelist. So one could say, well, this is very autobiographical, and in some ways, yes, it is autobiographical, but I never grew up on a ranch in Alberta, and I loved horses. I liked reading Zane Grey. I read books. I never broke my femur. So there are lots of things in the novel that you can look at and say, well, Arthur is me, but it's not really me. So in this particular instance, Arthur does eventually move off. He flies to Paris at the age of 19, trying to, chase after his love, which is French writers. And so what I will do is I will read a couple of sections just to give you a taste of the novel. And I'll start, I think what I thought I'd do is I'll do it in order of the scenes as they arrive, because we do get Arthur's birth at the beginning of the novel, and we get it from, of course, his perspective. And then he moves through to the age of 19. But the scene I want to read now, first, is Arthur at the age of probably about 13 in junior high school. And we've all gone to junior high school, and we all, especially boys, I think in some ways, who especially have gone to a rural high school, understand this sense of what's involved in protecting yourself and perhaps the fisticuffs that can ensue. So this is a scene from early in the novel. The thing to do, if you were a boy in junior high, was to fight. Bev is Arthur's brother, and he's 5 years older, 5 or 6 years older. Bev had a reputation as a solid fighter. He never lost. And because I was his brother, I was expected to be a fighter like him. I wasn't. Fighting scared me. I sidestepped confrontation, and when it came, I resorted to muteness or avoidance. And when I did finally speak, my words came out in a flurry, incomprehensible to those who had never learned to read and write properly. I was tall, which helped, and Bev was my brother, which proved a blessing at first, but eventually it was discovered by the tougher kids that, unlike my brother, I wasn't a willing fighter. Severin and Stu Turk were brothers at our school. They were tough and mean, and for no explanation, girls were attracted to them. Severin, the younger brother, had it in for me. Perhaps he didn't like my clothes, or the fact that I called him scurrilous, or a scallywag, words he didn't understand. This would have been during the S stage of my close perusal of the concise Oxford English Dictionary. In any case, a confrontation with Severin loomed. This was the era when we still lined up before entering school, and Severin took to standing behind me in line and jeering, "Hey, Swiss boy, give us a yodel." Severin thought that my family name, Volgemuth, was odd. And because he was just bright enough to know that the name was German, he took to calling me Adolf and Volkswagen and asking me where my clogs were. The first time I took him seriously, and I explained that it was the Dutch who in fact wore clogs. And then I tried to explain the origin of my name. It's actually Vol, which means well, and Gemüt, which means mind. I went on to explain that the Volkswagen was simply the people's wagon, and that as far as fine machinery and inventions and quality ideas go, the Germans are unsurpassed. He sneered. His face looked concave like a spade, and his large nostrils were the two rivets that attached the tool to the handle, which was his tall, lanky body. He pushed me, and I stumbled backwards. Still happy, Vol? He asked. I felt despair. The kind of despair that just comes without warning and makes it hard to breathe. I sucked in some air and said I would be much happier if I could be left alone. He laughed. Meet me after school, he said, behind the shitter. I have no desire to fight, I said. Fighting is for baboons and male lions who seek a mate. No desire? Who do you think you are? Desire? What bullshit. And he worked his hands in circles as his mouth sought out his words. I wondered if this was finally my punishment for the sin of carnality. Perhaps I even wanted to be punished. Even so, I was still leaning towards self-protection. What do you want? I asked. He paused, and his small eyes blinked as if this were not a question to be considered. Then his body sank slightly, and he said, I want to fight you. I want to beat the shit out of you. But why? I said. What do you mean, why? There's a scene near the beginning of Madame Bovary in which Charles Bovary arrives at a new school and enters the classroom and throws his hat against the wall like the other boys in the class because it was the thing to do. Bovary is laughed at and ridiculed, not least because he is awkward and slightly stupid and new to the school. I was a bit like Charles Bovary, though I knew I was not stupid. I was far better read and more intelligent, but I was Bovary for other reasons. I was awkward, did not know all the rules, was unfamiliar with social cues which made me prone to mockery and bullying, and like Bovary, I was the opposite of cosmopolitan. If I had any intrigue or sophistication in me, it was gained through reading, which for me was the most dangerous form of learning because it was done with little complexity. I was a void sucking up all knowledge, and this being so, I was also a lover of character, and I wanted to be someone other than myself. I wanted to be a character in a novel who elicited sympathy and pity and affection. I wanted to marry a very beautiful woman, even if it was a woman who would destroy herself and her family. Even at my young age, I understood that I could have been a better lover than Charles Bovary. One of the great pleasures of reading, especially reading down on a ranch in Alberta by a young boy who wants more, is the possibility of other lives. The possibility of extending one's arm and being pulled through the curtain onto a stage where Swan is in love, and Emma rides her carriage in circles through the city with the blinds drawn, and Joyce's hapless boy is infatuated with Mangan's sister, for whom he will buy a trinket at the market. I was that boy who rode the train to the bazaar, and I had failed to get the trinket. That afternoon, I had a presentation in language arts. I had chosen the topic of fish because of where I was born. It should be clear here that Arthur is born on a boat on the Pacific Ocean. I had chosen the topic of fish because where I was born, and because I knew a lot about the Pacific Coast salmon. Unfortunately, I was unaware that the other students resented my foreignness, and that they resented even more my constant references to the fact that I had been born on a boat. I liked to tell this story, thinking it was interesting, but at some point others usually became bored and said, "Oh, shut up, Volgamut," and they walked away. But during the presentation on fish, I once again mentioned my birth circumstances, and at this point Mr. Singleton, our teacher, stopped me and said, "Arthur, we've heard this story before. Perhaps you could save it for a special occasion. Maybe tell it once a year?" I nodded and looked down at my notes. Severn was guffawing in the back. I realized that everything in my presentation hinged on the metaphor of birth and life and the struggle of the salmon upriver and their inevitable death. And this being so, and because I had been cut short on the birth part, I was lost. I managed to finish, but it was a poorly done talk, far too short and very much lacking in clout. I basically offered up fish facts, and then I sat down. Mr. Singleton asked if there were any questions. Sonia Rempel, who had passed me love notes in grade 2 and had since then, up through the years, dated most of the boys in our grade, including Severn Turk, and was therefore considered a bit fickle, raised her hand. "If you were born on a Japanese boat, wouldn't that mean you were Japanese?" she asked. The class roared. Mr. Singleton smiled and said, "Okay, enough." I waited until the snickering had abated, and then I said that it was a brainless conclusion to make. It would be like saying if she, Sonia, had been born on a bed manufactured in Russia, that she was Russian. But I am almost Russian, Sonia said, swinging her shiny blonde hair. My mother was born there. I was dealing with imbeciles. I sat down, pretending arrogance, yet I felt deep humiliation, especially because Mr. Singleton, whom I hated at that moment, seemed to have enjoyed the repartee. Fullbear in January of 1837 wrote this: I felt very early a profound disgust with men from the moment I came into contact with them. From the age of 12, I was sent to school, and there I saw a shortcut to the world, its vices in miniature, its origins of ridicule, its little passions, its little coteries, its little cruelty. I saw the triumph of force, mysterious emblem of the power of God. I saw faults that would later become vices, vices that would be crimes, and children who would be men. I thought then, what a fine, incisive mind, what a resemblance to my own life, my own ideas, my world. When the bell rang to signal the end of school, I picked up my bag and ran, certain that Severn was coming for me. I ran outside and towards the nearby pasture. I climbed over the barbed wire fence and out into the middle of the field, and I sat down. A large limousine bull, which had been shipped over from France, grazed in the distance. Severn had followed me, of course. He paused outside the fence and he called out, "Hey, fish boy, you collecting more bullshit?" This was a comment full of wit, and I wondered if Severn was smarter than he appeared. I should have been terrified of Severn, which I was, but also of the bull, because the limousine is an unpredictable animal and much more dangerous than a Brahma. But I knew this particular bull. Dewey, the rancher my father worked for, had had several limousine bulls shipped over the previous year, and it had become my job to care for them, to feed them. It made perfect sense to me, the victim of Severn's violence, to run straight for the pasture near the school, where this limousine with its broad forehead and wide pelvis and dark brooding eyes grazed. The bull watched me carefully. The bus arrived, and the kids climbed on, and so Severn disappeared. Finally, alone, I moved slowly to the edge of the field, climbed over the fence, and I walked home, arriving just in time for supper. I spent the following week, every lunch hour and after school, in the pasture with the French bull, who came to understand that I was a tepid intruder. One day, at supper, my brother said, "Just fight him already. Surprise him." My mother nodded. She was ruthless, certainly able to see the damage that may be done to her little boy, yet unwilling to protect me. I did not understand her. My father said, "Let him be." And I hated him for saying that, because it meant he pitied me. Finally, 2 weeks later, full of resolution and dismay, I met Severn behind the outhouse. The whole school population, 77 students, had heard of the fight, and they were present, forming a ring. I removed my glasses and put them in my jeans pocket. I stepped towards Severn and raised my fists in a half-hearted manner. He swung and hit me in the temple. I fell back. He swung again and caught my mouth. "Fight, you dick," he said. "It's against my principles," I said. This infuriated him, and he pummeled me until I fell to the ground. The crowd cheered, and a few girls, tender souls, gasped and called out for this to stop. Bev was at the edge of the circle. He stood quietly, looking disgusted, hands in his pocket. To Severn's credit, he did not kick me when I was down. He pulled me to my feet and hit me again and again in the breadbasket, across the face, around my ears and neck. I fell again, and by this time the rabble had grown quieter, and Severn was panting. The crowd dispersed. We all went back to our classes. I cleaned myself up and returned to my homeroom and sat down and pulled out my notebook. I had a loose tooth, and I worked at it with my tongue the rest of the afternoon, but it did not fall out. Nettie Running Wolf, who was half Blackfoot and rarely said a word, passed me by on the way out of school and placed a folded piece of paper on my desk. I opened it later at home in my bedroom and discovered a pressed flower, yellow, with "Lily" written beneath it. At supper that evening, my mother surprised me when she accused Bev of standing by and doing nothing. "Is that what brother does?" Earlier, she had iced my jaw and cleaned my face with a warm cloth, muttering all the while about boys and violence. I did not mention my loose tooth because of my oversized fear of our family dentist. The last time I visited him, he had found 7 cavities and filled them all at once. Muttering above me, joking with his assistant, a tall redhead who tittered and snorted and pressed her chest against me as she suctioned up my saliva and blood. Like other women in my life, Even those who merely brushed up against me, I loved her. My mother daubed at my eye and said, "You should take boxing lessons." "Oh, he won't touch me again," I said. "How can you know that?" she cried. "Oh, he just won't. He garnered no pleasure from that." "Oh, Arthur, who taught you how to talk?" She shook her head. I thought it was fair and good that we managed to bewilder each other. So that's Arthur at the age of 13 years. He also meets, he has a cousin who's adopted, and she actually is his double cousin, and her name is Isabel. And she comes with a family from Montana to visit, and they spend time together, and they basically, they're quite physical with each other. They fall in love with each other, though they don't really know that they're in love with each other. But it's an intimate, good relationship. She's probably more confident than he is. Therefore, he's pulled into her vortex. And people have said to me that of all the characters in this novel, Isabel is their favorite, and they want to know what happened to Isabel. And I suppose I could write a novel about Isabel, but first I have to figure out what happened to Isabel. Did she marry Arthur? Did she run away? Is she still in Paris? You know, that sort of thing. Things remain open-ended. Anyway, Isabel is from the age of 13 till about the age of 19 till the end of the novel is a big part of Arthur's life. But also a big part is Bev, as he was in this scene, standing by and doing nothing, supposedly. The next scene I want to read is Bev has decided to join the American Army to fight in Vietnam, and this is the scene where Arthur and his father take Bev down to Fort Sill. So it's obvious that the time is about 1971, 1972, around there. I was 15 when my brother Bev joined the American Army to fight in Vietnam. My mother had a fit. We were at Sunday lunch, and Bev announced his plans. My mother threw down her napkin, pushed herself back from the table, and went into the kitchen. She banged dishes and threw pots around and called out that he was an idiot. Certainly not her blood, and she wouldn't stand for it. We were eating farmer sausage and macaroni salad in Zweibach, on which we slathered butter and jam and cheese. Coffee was served from a large silver tureen. There were cherry tarts for dessert. My father looked at Bev and said, "You're sure about this?" "I am." "Where will you sign up?" "Fort Sill in Oklahoma." "Well, how do you know they'll have you?" my father asked. "I don't, but I'm half American, and if they refuse, I'll come back." The father, in this case, is the American. The mother's Canadian. My father nodded. He pushed the bun into his mouth, chewed, swallowed, and then said, "She'll come to her senses." My mother returned to the table. She sat down. I didn't raise my boy so that he could head off to some unknown land to kill other men who have hearts and souls and hands and feet just like he has, or to have my boy killed. We come from a people that have always said no to war and to killing. We don't do that. We don't aim a gun at an enemy. We don't have enemies. If you want to save yourself, if you have some sort of guilt that you're trying to soothe, and go to school, go build a school or dig a well. Don't shoot people. Thou shalt not kill. Love your neighbor. Oh, listen to me. Listen to your mother. We were quiet. We weren't a family given to discussions about politics or world events. Dinner talk, when someone took the time to talk, centered on work and weather and local gossip. Folks in Tomorrow is the name of the town, folks in Tomorrow, like us, saw politics as a force from the East, where men in suits made poor decisions based on greed and selfishness. The West, Alberta, was a hinterland, backwards and unacknowledged, but absolutely necessary for the survival of the country, especially now with the oil crisis. What little news came into our house did so via the CBC and Time magazine. We had all seen the images coming out of Vietnam and the States, the protests, the killings at Kent State. But those were events so far removed that they felt like dramas created by a malicious playwright and acted out on a stage by unfortunate players who bore no resemblance to Bev or my father or my mother or me. We were untouched. My mother, though, was wiser. She knew that Bev would be touched by the war, and possibly horrifically, and so she railed and she fought. She had one last say, and she spoke to the ceiling. There are young boys, Americans, who are running up to Canada to avoid the draft. And then there's my son, who thinks he's better. Never said better, Bev said, though anyone who'd run from a duty has to be a bit of a weasel. Oh, a smart weasel then, Mother said, and she turned to my father. Tell him he can't go. He's a man, Noreen. He'll do what he chooses. It's not a choice, my mother said. That isn't choosing. You might as well shoot me if that's choosing. Excuse me. Perhaps because she was about to say goodbye to her eldest son, my mother spent time complaining to me about Bev. She didn't raise him to go off to some fetid land to kill and maim, or worse yet, to be killed and maimed. Don't get it into your head, Arthur, that this is normal or right. I let her talk. I said nothing. She was educating me in the ways of love and favoritism. For even as she complained about Bev, I understood that we were talking about me. My father and I drove Bev down to Oklahoma. We crossed the border at Coots in a pickup, me in the middle between my father and my brother. Bev's green suitcase laid out in the back. The border guard was an older man, with a handlebar mustache and a languid attitude, who was proud to be a Canadian who had made up his mind to eradicate evil in the world. We slept that first night in a campground near the Wyoming border. Our family had an old canvas baptismal tent with no bottom. And at night the mosquitoes came in through the cracks and attacked us, and I heard my father swatting and tossing. Bev slept like a baby. When I woke in the morning, my father was tending the fire and making coffee. For breakfast, we barbecued wieners on sticks and dipped them into a jar of strawberry jam my mother had sent along. My father said it was the best meal he'd ever had. Bev was quiet. I'd taken along the Reader's Digest World Atlas, and as my father drove, I spent time studying the map of Southeast Asia, trying to ascertain the layout of the place. On the inside front cover, there was a legend with various colored rectangles that made it easy to find the country you wanted to explore. I was surprised to discover that Vietnam was not very large. It was shaped like the tail of a cat, the tip of the tail dropping down towards the Gulf of Thailand and the South China Sea. Odd to think that something that small could be the cause of so much trouble. I found various facts, and I offered them up for everyone's digestion, as if I were back in school making a presentation. Square mileage, GDP, literacy rate, population growth. It turned out that the population was almost 3 times that of Canada's, and this was startling to me, though neither my father nor Bev seemed interested. At some point, I found myself in France, and it comes out in the novel that Arthur is absolutely in love with France. At some point, I found myself in France, poring over the names of various villages and imagining a life on the coast of Bretagne, perhaps in Saint-Malo, where the tides moved and one walked hand in hand with a beautiful French girl on the wet beach while crabs skittered here and there. When we dropped off Bev at Fort Sill, we didn't hang around, we just hugged my brother goodbye, and then we drove back towards Alberta. That's when my father became looser and softer. He explained the politics of Vietnam to me and the politics of the United States. He described the ambitions of the most powerful nation in the world, a place where he had been raised. He said that hegemony produced fear. He said that word, and I wrote it down in the notebook that I always carried in my back pocket. He said that the Americans were foolish, though they thought they were wise. But this is what happens when someone has power and little wisdom. He said that no matter what the Americans did, be it good or bad, they would be criticized. There was no winning when you were the king and everyone else was a serf. I wondered if Bev would be okay, and he said that there was no telling. He said that men liked war. They might say they didn't, but the fact was that men liked to fight. He said that if God had made one mistake, it was giving men a love for battle. I had never heard him criticize God in that way, and it stirred me in a strange fashion. It made my father seem less predictable. And then he said that he was afraid for Bev, and he turned his face away from me. We slept in a motel that night. My father said that the tent was useless, and we would be better off sleeping in the open air rather than trapping a bunch of mosquitoes and then entering that same trap and offering ourselves up as food. Our family did not have a lot of money, and so taking a motel, no matter how cheap the room, was an extravagance that pleased me greatly. The window of our room gave out onto a parking lot where our pickup sat. My father and I shared the only bed, and after we had both showered, he read to me from the book he had with him. It was a novel called An American Tragedy by a man named Theodore Dreiser. Though my father was already well into it, he started from the beginning. And at some point, I laid my head on his shoulder and followed along as he read. And the words washed over me, but even more so, my father's voice washed over me and entered my ears, and I was a child again. And we were reading to the horses that he would break in the pasture, beyond our little house where our family lived and ate and slept. I would continue to read the book later, back home, taking it from my father's table beside his armchair, and reading it innocently, as a story, and only discovering in my later years that it was about ambition and failure and class division. The style was odd, almost simple, and yet it moved me and created in me a longing for the skill to tell a story in that manner, plainly, with force and consequence. Earlier, coming out of the shower, my father had been naked. I had seen him naked before, but never that close. I saw his penis, and it resembled mine, though it was slightly larger, and when I saw him naked like that, for some reason I felt sad and ashamed. That is what I felt at that moment, but the feelings, the shame and the sadness went away when he began to read. That's the section when he's a little bit older. I'm not sure how much more I should read. I could read a little section yet and then have questions. I'm not sure what kind of time we have here. We're okay still? Yeah. I talked a little bit about the process of writing. The process of publishing a book is a whole other matter. I think Hilde referred to something that she heard me talk about, that for every book I finish, there's a space between the actual finishing of the book and the time when the book comes out. And that's usually a year to a year and a half. And I find that a very anxious time. And what happens to me is that we have a home in Winnipeg that's about 100 years old, and it requires a lot of work. So for every book that I finish, I look for a project to do in the house after I finish the book. So I can walk through my house and I can say, that was where I finished the time in between. That was where I finished the Case of Linnaeus. And this is where I finished the Age of Hope. And for each book, I did the basement, I did a porch upstairs. Well, for Leaving Tomorrow, I put in a heated floor in our breakfast nook. Heated floor with like wires underneath ceramic tile. And so that was my project for Leaving Tomorrow. And then the book comes out. And it's always there too. There's a certain amount of anxiety, because no matter how indifferent you want to appear about the process of a book coming out, and you're cavalier about it, and you don't really care what people think, of course, that there's always that need to know what do people think, right? And then you find out that they don't think much, or they think a lot. And as I said to Paul and Hilde tonight, if anything, if I've learned any sort of nugget of wisdom from publishing 8 novels, it's that you're never as good as people say you are, and you're never as bad as people say you are. And that's perhaps the best way to approach it. Yeah, but still, there is that anxiety, and for me, so if any of you have any, I'm almost finished fixing my house. If you need someone to work on a project, I don't guarantee it though. The last little section I'm going to read is very short. It's just at the end of the first section. There's 2 sections. One is leaving. I can't remember the title of the first section. Oh yes, I am telling you this. Which, I am telling you this is the first section, the title of the first section, and that was originally the title of the novel that I wrote. And I thought it was a great title. Well, my publisher didn't, and my editor didn't, and my friends didn't. So we went with Leaving Tomorrow, which is a sort of play on the town of tomorrow. I still think I'm telling you this is a great title. I wrote, this is Arthur at an older age, and he's talking a little bit about Isabel. I wrote in my notebook the names of the girls and the women I had loved and still loved. Hildegard, Mother, M, Tamiko, Miss Chu, Nettie Running Wolf, Alice Dewey, Sammy, Stella Armstrong, Isabel, 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 Isabel. My mind wandered, but my pen kept writing Isabel's name over and over again. She was honest. She did not make me anxious. She did not pretend to love me. She did not ask for anything. She let me see her naked. She let me be naked. At that time, though through letter writing, Isabel and I had agreed that we needed contact with intellectuals and writers and poets, people who could offer us a higher sense of thinking. And so we decided to write those authors whom we admired the most. She wrote to Susan Sontag. She received a letter back from someone at a publishing house in New York. A lovely letter that thanked her for hers and for her interest in Miss Sontag's oeuvre. Unfortunately, Miss Sontag was in Europe and wasn't available. A work of Miss Sontag's was enclosed in the mail, a book of essays that Isabel cherished and that made her further worship Sontag. I had considered writing W.H. Auden because I loved his poetry, but he had just died. In any case, I was mostly interested in the best of the French writers, most of whom were dead as well. Baudelaire died at 46 after suffering a stroke and aphasia. Camus died in a car crash. Fullbear died at Coissé of a cerebral hemorrhage in 1880 at the age of 58. I did write a few letters to Samuel Beckett, who was still alive. He was Irish, but wrote in French, and therefore I felt some affinity towards him. I wrote long letters in English asking him about his ideas and the tremendous silences of his characters. I never heard from him or his publisher, which was a tremendous silence in itself. I assumed that my letters never found him. Finally, I wrote a letter to Jean-Paul Sartre, and in my letter I asked Monsieur Sartre if he had any advice for a young man who came from the provinces but also had a hunger for literature and a higher meaning of life. This is what I wrote. I have great affection for Stendhal and Fullbear, especially Fullbear, and I know from my reading about you that you have a high appreciation for Fullbear. I admire this in you. My inclinations lean towards the French writers, even though my French is non-existent. I make do with translations. I recently read your play, No Exit, and I want to ask you if you believe in hell. Perhaps this is too obvious. I wrote this letter in French, translating it from my English with the help of the French teacher at my high school. I did not tell Madame Manche, to whom the letter was written. I simply explained that I was practicing my French. She was pleased to help me, and so the words I used were raised to a new level. One day, several months later, having assumed that my letter to Sartre had also gotten lost during this trip over the ocean, I came home from school and found a letter addressed to Monsieur Arthur Volgemuth with a return address from Edition Gallimard, Paris. I went to my room, locked my door, and I ripped open the envelope. It was not from Monsieur Sartre, but from someone at the publishing house who was named Laurent. The letter was brief and to the point. Monsieur Sartre, unfortunately, does not do correspondence. Thank you for the letter, and please be assured that we wish you all the best. I was disappointed, but also relieved. And being relieved, I was able to set my mind at ease and ascend to a place where I composed the letter that might have been written had Monsieur Sartre done correspondence. Dear Monsieur W., thank you for your honest letter, and thank you for your interest in literature. This is the first letter I have received from a young man in Western Canada. I received many letters from readers in France. A young man who shows a keen interest in humanity, and a shared love of Flaubert, and a commitment to action. For commitment is not just an idea, it is an act. Regarding the writing of novels, here is some advice. A novel is like a dinner party. You need a solid place upon which to set your table. This is your foundation. And then you organize the table according to the number of settings and the people you invite. Invite characters of surprising and moral character, at least those who grapple with what is right, or those who make decisions that shock. Typically, the struggle is of a moral nature. The character suffers anxiety, or has a fear of death, or sex, or violence, or perhaps there is a synthesis of all of these, but in the end, the story hinges on a working out of despair and hope. There can be no shrinking from the truth, or from the absurdity of that truth. Those who cower simply want escapism. Don't cozy up to the reader. Don't patronize. And finally, if you can say what a story is about, the story isn't worth reading. And yes, narrative is tyrannical. It demands that breadcrumbs be dropped along the path. Learn how to drop the crumbs without revealing that you are dropping them. Knowing this, that a character, just like man, makes himself in spite of eventualities in a meaningless world. I wrote Isabel and gave her the whole of what I had imagined Monsieur Sartre's response might be. She was impressed by the description of novel writing and asked me where I had stolen this from. I wrote back and told her that I had made it up, which I had. And this impressed her even more, which made me happy, because it has always been my goal to win Isabel's affection through the working of my mind. Monsieur Sartre's final sentence in that fabricated letter, the notion that a person must make oneself in spite of the eventualities in a meaningless world, became true for me, because this is what I intended for myself. My first 17 years or so had been fat with ideas and occurrence and wonder and imagination, a cacophony of pleasure, the absorption of knowledge, the stretching of the sinew of my mind, the mind diseased yet sharp. What a marvel. But then came a few thin years. And I call them thin because I had lived a repetitive and inauthentic existence. My mind contracted. I fell into the tedium of work and the temptation of lucre and the appeal of the body. I learned that for every action there is a reaction, and that sometimes the reaction is no action at all. I discovered my double self, and there were times when I faced one of my selves that I did not like what I saw. And yet, throughout this, I was still able to consider myself a great star in the sky that hung like a black curtain over those plains. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. David is, I think, open to questions about his reading, about this novel, or about other novels that are available outside. I thought I might begin with one thing, and it's prompted in part by something you just mentioned. And I remember that the very first announcements I saw of the novel were of a novel called I'm Telling You This. And I was struck, maybe I'd be with your publisher and your friends. I thought, well, that's a peculiar title. So I'm not going to ask you about that title, but I want you to think about answering the question anyway, because I'm going to ask it in a different way. And that is, I'm going to ask a question that I prepared, and that relates, I think, to some degree. I mean, I'm really pleased about one of the passages you read. It has to do with one of those passages, just a little bit. And that is, while I was anticipating your reading this evening, I wondered what passage you'd read. Would it be those mesmerizing opening pages? I mean, the novel is just beautifully gripping at the very beginning. Or would it be one of those other passages that you've flipped past here that reveal what the Winnipeg Review called your preternatural talent for depicting young lust? You didn't read any of those. Or, and this is where my prepared question relates to what I started with, would it be one of those, what I found to be truly affecting passages of reading? Passages that convey the texture of a relationship defined by this one person, as in the scene that David read, the father reading to the adolescent son. One person reading to another. And these passages were among my favorites. So I wondered what each of those chunks of prose, where you have one person reading to another, would sound like. You know, and what it would sound like if you read those. And so can you say a little bit about, were you quite conscious of producing that sort of episode over again? And does it have anything to do with that first title, I'm Telling You This?
So you're asking a general question. You're not asking specifically about my readings tonight. But
No.
Yeah, you're asking about
About those passages in the novel where you have characters reading to
I mean, okay. I went through about 5 titles for this book, and my first title was My First Love, and I think My First Love. Now, Turgenev wrote a novel called First Love, and so I was aware of that, and it was very different, obviously a very different novel from what I wrote here. And that's okay. There's no copyright on titles. You can call a book Crime and Punishment if you want. Good luck. So there's no copyright. But My First Love, I think, really caught what I was trying to capture in this novel, which is a first love of words. And at supper, I think it was at supper we were talking, or maybe earlier, we were talking about what, I think the Christian Week came, or no, MB Herald came up. And of course, the MB Herald passed through our house. And my father was a MB pastor, and of course we were part of the MB church, and it passed through our house, and I said, oh yeah, I read that. And Hilary was surprised that I would have read the MB Herald. I said, I read whatever showed up in the house. If it was the MB Herald, if it was the cornflakes box, you just devoured it, you know? And you probably read the cornflakes box 3 times because, you know, they were words. So it was, I don't think there's a, what I do think is that what this book was trying to do, what I was trying to do when I wrote the book was show a love for words and language. And of course there's an ironic sort of epigraph in the novel that begins the novel, and it comes from Ecclesiastes 12:12. And it's, but beyond this, my son, be warned, the writing of many books is endless, and excessive devotion to books is wearying to the body. And of course, this is a warning to Arthur, right, to me, and of course, but I will not heed it, because it's a love for language and storytelling, and I think I wanted to give Arthur that sense of, he breaks his femur at one point when he falls off his horse, and he's in traction for three to 4 months, and that's where he discovers books. The town librarian delivers books to him, and he devours them, and that's where his first, I mean, he's read up till then, but that's when she starts to introduce him to literature. And so it's when he's in traction that he's on a bed and can't move, that he's given books and discovers well, the French writers, the Russian writers. Yeah. So I didn't want it in any way, and there's always that danger that it would be pretentious, that it would come across as well, look at Bergen showing off, you know, about books and stuff like that. But I think it was a love letter to writing and to books and reading. Is really what